Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Stover from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, which is a joint initiative of the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University. And on behalf of our Executive Director, Dr. Sheila Brown, and our Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you here this evening for our joint presentation with the Department of Philosophy at St. Mary's University. In a moment, I'll introduce you to Dr. John McKinnon, who's the chair of the philosophy department at St. Mary's University, who's put a lot of legwork into this particular event this evening. But before I do that, I'd like to call your attention to the table at the back, the small one at the back, which has a sign-up sheet. If you're not familiar with CCEPA and the events that we put on, you can sign your name up there and you'll be notified of everything that we do. There's also a couple of promotional pieces up there that indicate things that we've got coming up. Most notably, I'll mention that in this very same room on the 27th of October, the Honourable Flora MacDonald will be in this room to give the CCEPA annual lecture, and it will be about Afghanistan, a study in ethical contrasts, which will be quite interesting. On October 13th, the other event that we have going is the part one of a 5-part national series, which is a first for CCEPA to take our show on the road. And it's the Trust in New Sciences series. And on October 13th, we feature Dr. Nicholas Rose of the Bios Centre from the London School of Economics, and he'll be talking about remaking the human, re-engineering selfhood in the 21st century. That's at Alumni Hall at University of King's College, and it's certainly one not to be missed. The other thing I want to mention is in front of you, you have evaluation forms. What you think about our events is quite important to us, so if you could put down your thoughts, we'd greatly appreciate that. And now I'd like you to help me welcome Dr. John McKinnon, who will introduce our guest speaker tonight.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 7th Annual Lecture in Public Philosophy, this year sponsored by both the Department of Philosophy at St. Mary's University and CCEPA. To quote Chris, the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, a joint initiative of the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University. I'd also like to thank a number of individuals and offices who've supported this series with enthusiasm and often with funds from its inception. First, the President of St. Mary's, Dr. Colin Dodds, the Vice President Academic, Dr. Terry Murphy, and the Dean of Arts, Dr. Esther Enns. Thanks, too, to members of their respective staffs, particularly Stephanie Babcock in the President's Office and Joan Whitney in the Office of the Dean of Arts. I'd also like to extend our appreciation to the University's Visiting Speakers Committee and the Chair of that committee, Dr. Linda Christensen Ruffman. This year's lecture would not have been possible without the assistance and, more often than not, guidance of Chris Stover, whom you've just met, General Manager of CCEPA, so my sincere thanks to her. We hope that this event promises other fruitful and at least occasional joint efforts in the years to come. Finally, I must thank Dr. Roland Marshall, who after 32 years as a professor of philosophy at St. Mary's, retired from full-time teaching in 1993. His commitment to the university as an active member of faculty and in retirement has been unstinting, and his generosity to the university matched by few. It was a trust fund established by Dr. Marshall that enabled us to inaugurate this series several years ago. And I'd like to ask you to acknowledge Dr. Marshall. He's right here in the audience here. Past lectures have addressed issues ranging from cultural appropriation and judicial activism to children's rights and social trust. This evening's lecture concerns the topic of morality and starvation. It will be delivered by Dr. Joseph Mendola of the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, where he is chair and professor of philosophy. Dr. Mendola earned his doctorate in philosophy at the University of Michigan, after which he was awarded a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Rochester. In addition to those two institutions, he has taught at the University of Oklahoma and North Carolina State University, as well as the University of Nebraska. Dr. Mendola has published in many of the world's most respected philosophy journals on a wide range of issues and is the author of 3 books: Human Thought, published by Kluwer, Goodness and Justice, A Consequentialist Moral Theory, published by Cambridge University Press, and Anti-Externalism, published by Oxford University Press. He has recently completed the manuscript for a 4th book entitled Human Interests or Indeterminacy in Ethics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Mendola, this year's lecturer in public philosophy, who will address the question, what are our ethical obligations to the starving?
thanks to CCEPA and the department, to Roland and all the other people who've supported this series, for all your hospitality so far. It's wonderful being here. The topic is ethical obligations to the starving, and in particular, it's the topic of individual ethical obligations to the starving. So let me talk a little bit at the beginning about what the question is, and then we'll try to get into the question. Roughly 1 billion people live in extreme poverty in the world today. Between 15,000 and 35,000 children under the age of 5 die every day from starvation and poverty-related diseases. People differ about the details, but these are basically uncontroversial facts. But these things are not inevitable. At this point, the details become more controversial, but one plausible calculation is that shifting approximately 1.25% of the aggregate income enjoyed by the 1 billion people like you and me who live in high-income economies would provide the resources required to eradicate serious poverty worldwide. So here's a problem. It's a serious problem. It's an eradicable problem if humans got together to work on it. Our question today is what these facts imply about the individual ethical obligations of well-off people like you and me, people who have enough disposable income for fancy meals and vacations and concert tickets and all those other things we like that. We're not talking about what our governments or societies should do, but what we should do as individuals in the face of these facts. Though, as we will see, I think today, these questions aren't easy to separate. They're entwined in various ways. And the topic of the day is what we as individuals are morally obliged to do, not what it would be better if we did, but what are our moral obligations, our moral duties, such that if we fail in these duties, what we do is wrong, and we are, at least in that respect, immoral. So that's the issue of the day. Philosophers disagree about everything, as I'm sure you know. Philosophical ethicists disagree about many things too, but there's a large measure of agreement on at least certain basic facts about our individual moral obligations. Almost all philosophers who work on ethics agree that these aren't going to be surprises. It's generally wrong to murder. It's generally wrong to lie in harmful ways. It's wrong to gratuitously injure other people. You don't really need philosophers to tell you this, but philosophers will agree with you if you think this. Though philosophers disagree considerably about why these things are true, why these particular wrong acts are wrong, and they also disagree considerably about what we ought to do in various hard cases, cases where perhaps a lie is helpful or where an injury is not gratuitous. And the topics that we're talking about today, unfortunately, span some in which the nuanced disagreements between philosophers who are ethicists matter. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those disagreements now. One pretty large group of philosophers that are called consequentialists, for reasons I think that'll be clear in a minute, think that when acts are right or wrong, it's basically because of the consequences of those acts. Acts with good consequences are generally speaking right. Acts with bad consequences are generally speaking wrong. And the rightness or wrongness of the actions depends on the consequences that they have. These people, these consequentialists, tend to think, though this is optional, but they tend to think that when something very bad happens because, here's a subtlety, but it matters, that they tend to think that when something very bad happens because you fail to do something, when you don't do something, say when you fail to send some of your excess cash to UNICEF to save a starving child, which I failed to do today, that is immoral. You're not doing something has very bad consequences, and it is very bad consequences that makes doing things, or even failing to do things, immoral. That's one group of philosophers. There's another group of philosophers that are called sometimes deontologists or Kantians for what are, for our purposes, historical accidents, who tend to think that no, this is wrong. You're really only responsible for for the effects of what you actually do, or perhaps even not for its effects, but for the very act that you do. You're only positively morally responsible for what you do. So that if you fail to send some check to UNICEF and somebody dies as a result, it's no moral big deal. Perhaps someone dies, but it's not because of what you positively do. It's because of what you fail to do. They tend to think, people like this, Kantians, deontologists speaking very loosely, that it's not immoral not to send money to UNICEF. It's just a failure to act, and hence can't be. So, speaking very roughly, summing up, consequentialists think we have a moral obligation to save the starving, where deontologists do not. That's the simple setup. But unfortunately, we got to get a nuance further in to get to our question than that, because it's not quite that simple now. Even most Kantians and deontologists these days, the ones who think, generally speaking, it's probably not immoral to save your money to go to the movies rather than spend it on UNICEF, generally these people admit that you sometimes, once in a while, under some conditions, have real moral obligations to do things when it would be very bad if you failed to do them. So they think that sometimes failing to do something, if it causes a harm, is immoral. It's just that it's not immoral in the case where you fail to send money to UNICEF. They distinguish between different cases in which you fail to act and as a consequence bad things happen, and say you are highly immoral in some but only some of the cases. We found out about this relatively subtle difference of opinion among ethicists because of work by a famous consequentialist philosopher named Peter Singer, which was first published in a famous article called, among philosophers anyway, called Famine, Affluence, and Morality in about 1972 in a journal called Philosophy Public Affairs. And in that article, he contrasts two cases, which I'll call the envelope and the shallow pond. So now I'm going to give you two cases, and I'm going to ask you to think about these two cases and what you think about them. The first is the envelope. I've already hinted at the envelope. It goes like this. In your mailbox, there's a request from UNICEF. After reading it over, you correctly believe that unless you send in a check for $100, then instead of each living many more years, over 30 more children will die soon. Now suppose, like me, you throw the mailing in your trash, along with the other junk mailings, and send nothing, and consequently 30 more children die. Almost all, well, let me ask you what you think. How many people think that's seriously immoral? Does anybody think that's seriously immoral? Couple. More than, generally speaking, philosophical ethicists, except a few hardcore consequentialists, including Peter Singer, think that they agree with the majority of you that that's not immoral. That seems, at least to them, intuitively, perfectly morally acceptable. If it isn't, then many of us are immoral. So most of you have the intuition that most of the philosophers who talk about these cases have. They think you're right, that's not seriously immoral. Perhaps that means that most of us are deontologists, that we think that you're not responsible for the deaths of the children because they only happened because of what you failed to do, not because of what you did. You didn't shoot them, after all. But the real puzzle is that there's this other case, this shallow pond, that Singer also developed, about which most people have a different view, but I shouldn't be spinning it like that. I should let you have your own view about it first, but listen to the case and see what you think. It goes like this. The path to your job passes by a shallow ornamental pond. On the way to work one day, you notice a small child has fallen in and is in danger of drowning. So that you're going by the pond, the little child's in the pond drowning. If you wade in and pull the child out, It will mean getting your clothes muddy and ruining your new shoes, which we can assume you just paid $200 for. And you'll also be docked some pay for being late to work, we can presume. I don't know, another $100. If you pass by the child, let them drown. Your clothes and shoes will be fine, and you'll get the pay, but the child will die. The child will drown. Suppose you pass by, as I think most of us wouldn't, but suppose you pass by, and as expected, the child dies. There's a sort of agreement about whether this act or failure to act was seriously immoral. But let me ask you, you walk by the drowning child, you keep on going to work to preserve your shoes and your new shoes and your clothes. How many people think that's pretty immoral? Okay. Most philosophers agree with you. That's pretty immoral. Almost everybody who's confronted with this case says that passing by like that would be seriously immoral. But notice, this is the weird thing, that the very bad thing that happens in this case that seems to make it immoral happens because you failed to do something. And that was what we originally thought might protect us, or maybe some people thought might protect us from a troublesome obligation in the envelope case. So here's the question. If it's seriously immoral to walk by the pond, but it's not seriously immoral to throw the envelope in the trash, what's the difference? And is the difference something that can justify our view, almost everyone's view, that in one case there's an immorality, in the other there isn't? There are many differences between the cases, of course. And maybe we can get in later in the questions to talking about what you think might be the difference. One difference, though, there's a difference between one child and 30, for instance, but of course that one cuts the wrong way, right? Because in the envelope case, it's the 30 kids dying and only one dying in the pond, and presumably it isn't the fact that only one died that makes it worse. There's a large literature, a huge literature, in which philosophers and others have tried, on the basis of these cases, to get clear about what the difference might be plausibly between them and whether it can justify our intuition that in one case there's an immorality and in another case there isn't. Some think we can't justify a different treatment of those cases. Notice what they're going to say about our obligations to the starving. They're fairly intense, and if we fail to do those things, it's more or less analogous to walking by the drowning child in the pond. If you're interested in this literature or these cases, and if they speak to you in some way, you'd like to think about them more, there's a good introduction to it. There's a philosopher named Peter Unger, U-N-G-E-R, who has a cheap paperback book published by Oxford called Living High and Letting Die. And actually, he sends his royalties to Oxfam from it, so you can do a good deed even by buying the book. He's got a lot of cases in there, and it turns out he's a hardcore consequentialist like Singer, and he ends up saying that we can't make any sense of the distinction. But he does present the literature, and you might draw another conclusion on the basis of looking at it. Most deontologists, however, today still think that someday they will develop a coherent rationale for some moral difference between the cases. Though being philosophers, of course, they disagree about what it's going to be when we get there. If you want to look at the state of the art on that side of the aisle, there's a great and brilliant and incredibly complete book on it, but which is called Intricate Ethics by Francis Kamm, K-A-M-M. And the difficulty is, the title of the book is self-explanatory. It is incredibly intricate, and you better bring your strong coffee and a lot of patience when you read the book. But it really thoroughly examines various sophisticated attempts to draw a distinction between the cases. Francis is on the other side. She thinks there is a difference between the cases, but the difference she thinks is there would take me 2.5 hours to explain, and I'd get it wrong. So you have to look at her for that. Today, to skirt this interesting but very complicated intellectual morass, in which it's very hard to find your way around, we're going to come at our problem from another direction. That was sort of the direct route. Now we're going to try an indirect route. From what we've seen so far, it would seem that deciding on our obligations to the starving depends on deciding the hard and intricate issue of when exactly our very harmful failures to act, say in the shallow pond case but not in the envelope case, are very immoral. But Thomas Pogge, P-O-G-G-E, in a book called World Poverty and Human Rights, which I also recommend to you, which has the best cover picture of any ethics book I'm familiar with, and I'm not going to give it away, has had a new and rather terrifying idea. This is his idea. He said, even deontologists and consequentialists agree on one thing. They agree that we actually do very harmful things to innocent people when we ourselves positively do very harmful things to innocent people, say commit a serious gratuitous injury of them. That's agreed by almost everybody to be highly immoral, or at least usually highly immoral. At a minimum, most agree, we owe some kind of reparation to the people who we've gratuitously injured. And Pogge's idea is, his terrifying idea is, that we ourselves have actually harmed the very poor of the world, and so we owe them reparation. Notice how this, if he's right, that skirts around the intricacies we were talking about before. What we have actually done is already immoral through our positive harm of the poor, of the very poor, and it will be even worse to fail to make the reparations we owe them. On this, he thinks, deontologists and consequentialists should agree. Well, they might agree about the general principle, but of course, there are many complexities on this route as well. First of all, we need to consider if there really is reason to think our own positive action has really helped create the poverty of the very poor, as Pogge argues. There's a second complexity. Even if we have done things that have harmed the very poor by our own action, maybe the harm each of us does on our own is trivial on its own. Maybe if Pogge can convince us that our practices of wasteful consumption, our support of governments that engage in strong-arm bargaining, favoring our national agricultural interests, we're coming back to that part, are really a positive cause of the poverty of the poor of the world, still our individual positive contributions to that big overall hurt are each trivial. If I buy a wasteful, gas-guzzling, smog-belching SUV to drive to the mall to go window shopping every other Saturday, still my individual contribution to global warming is trivial. My individual contribution is trivial. It may seem that doing something that is your own small positive contribution to what is yet a huge global harm isn't all that immoral, or maybe not immoral at all, because whether you contribute your part or not doesn't make much difference. The world will warm regardless of what a particular individual will do. I've meant so far already to give you stuff to think about. And if you want to stop hearing about it now, what I'm going to go on now, you've got enough to think about, so feel free to stop listening at this point. But I've got a theory about this, and here's where I come in. And my theory, it's what I think. It may not, I don't think there's a philosopher alive who agrees with me about it, or would agree about it if they thought about it. You probably have a different view. I'm going to tell you my little idea here and stimulate you, I hope, to think about what your own view on these topics are. Okay? So now I'm going to start to pontificate about ride my hobby horse. I'm a consequentialist. I think that right and wrong depends on good and bad consequences. But I'm a peculiar kind of consequentialist who thinks that the deontologists and the Kantians, the opposition, are really onto some important things and are often right about exactly what acts are right or wrong. So if you want moral advice, I think don't ask a utilitarian, don't ask a consequentialist, ask a Kantian or a deontologist. But I think they're very wrong about why the acts in question that they think are wrong are wrong. That's because I think that ethics crucially involves group acts. So now we're going to talk about group acts, believe it or not. What's a group act? First question. It happens when it's literally true to say, if it ever is, that some group of distinct people as a unit tries to do something. That's the key. We certainly say things like this. We say, like I know I've said, my department was trying to get that position out of the dean for 10 years and we finally succeeded. Notice the what we were trying to do thing in there. The department was trying, of which I'm a part. Or you say, that couple was trying to work it out as a unit. Maybe we don't mean it when we say things like this. Maybe those are just metaphors. Even I think it's just a metaphor when I say in Nebraska in the middle of the winter and my car doesn't really succeed in starting, I say, well, it was trying to turn over. I didn't mean that really literally, but I said it. Maybe group acts are like that. Maybe we don't mean it when we say groups try. Or maybe you think these claims aren't metaphors, but rather just a kind of shorthand for what the individuals are trying to do. So even if you think they're group acts, you probably aren't going to agree with me about what exactly they are. I've got a theory, and you don't want to hear it, but it's got like reasons, and the reasons why we blame people, and these is what part of what constitutes an act as being a group act. I think you have a group act basically when people together are working towards some goal which they recognize, and that they would complain about defectors on the basis of failure of reciprocity, failing to keep their part up, failing to do their part, and also for failing to pursue the good in question. But that's just a theory. Second part of the view is, which you may not agree with at all. I think that group acts are deeply involved in ethics. So now I'm going to explain that part and then come back to our issue about obligations to the starving. I think many of our moral practices, our practices of calling certain things morally right and wrong and blaming people who engage in them, or morally praising people for doing things, I think those are group acts. I think that when, for instance, we don't, as a body of people, we mostly don't lie. We lie some. There are individual differences. We don't lie in a lot of cases where we might get away with it. And we have a tendency to criticize people who do lie in a negative way and various kinds of failures. I think there's a big group act of people spread over millennia, spread over the world, where we're trying not to lie. May not be right, but I think there is. And I think that such a group act is to be assessed morally by consideration of its consequences. I think that it's immoral, highly immoral sometimes, to defect from a group act with very good consequences. So if together over millennia people have been cooperating on this big cooperative project of not lying, and if it has really good consequences overall, if it makes the world a better place, if somebody defects, if somebody doesn't do their part, hold up their end, I think that is immoral, and its immorality is weighted at the value of the whole act. That's one part of this. And that's actually a little hard to understand, and maybe it doesn't make sense. But actually for today, we don't need that part of the view. We need the flip side of that. That's about our moral obligations when we engage in very harmful group acts. When we, as a group, engage in some act, which is us together trying to do something, and it has heinous consequences. And the question is, what's our responsibility for that? What's our individual responsibility for our participation in that huge, harmful group act? I think, you can see why I think this, I think that how immoral our individual participation in a harmful group act is a matter of how bad the consequences of the whole are. It's just like what I would say about group acts with good consequences, but what's upside down. Here's a simple case that I think makes this idea sound plausible. There's other ones that make it sound implausible, so I'm editing. I'm giving you the one that makes it sound good. Then we're done with that. Then we'll talk about the application to poverty in the world. Suppose I'm part of a group of 1,000 people who all really don't like a certain associate dean. And we decide to capture the dean and put him in a chair and then take turns through the day, each performing a little mild torture of him. We have an agreement. We sat in a room and agreed solemnly to act together to torture the dean, or associate dean, in that way. But each individual on their own is only going to do a little tiny, relatively mild harm, something equivalent to kicking him in the shins or something. Maybe that doesn't sound like a plausible case when just 1,000 people are involved. Maybe each harm's going to have to be significant. Well, then you make it 10,000 if it helps you. Or put the dean in a chair hooked up to electrodes and give each of the 10,000 people a button to push that delivers a tiny electric shock. Just a tiny shock, but which adds up when all 10,000 of us do it to some very significant kind of electrical torture. I think, well, let me ask, do we agree that that's a heinous thing that we do to even that associate dean? Do we agree? I think so. But each of us only does a little tiny bit of it. So the question is, how immoral are each of us? And I'm hoping on the basis of that case that you're going to think, pretty immoral, pretty highly immoral, because somehow the responsibility for the whole is spread along amongst all of us, but in such a way that it doesn't divide, right? We each have something like full responsibility for the whole. That's the idea. I don't know how many people have that intuition about the case? How many people think it'd be pretty immoral to engage in that little, yeah, okay. So maybe you're with me to that point. Okay. This view morally weights participation in heinous group acts at the full negative consequential weight of the whole, just as it weights participation in beneficent group acts at the full consequential weight of the whole. Okay, let me skip some. Now I'm going to try to put this theory to work. I'm going to argue that we participate in group acts that are responsible for extreme poverty in the world, and that we have, in that way, harmed the very poor in something like the way Poga suggests, and so we owe the poor reparation, and if we don't, we're highly immoral. That's the idea. My case will have two elements. The first element will be the observation that those of us who are well off engage in practices. And, we're part of social arrangements. No group acts here necessarily, but we're part of social arrangements that are extremely harmful to the very poor, and also in other ways. And also that those who represent us in our interests, say our legislators, act in ways extremely harmful to the very poor. That's the first part of the case. We don't have us yet doing anything, except we're kind of participating in social practices, but we aren't actually doing any harm. Our representatives are doing things. The second element of my case will be suggesting relationships between these acts of others and our practices, on the one hand, and group acts in which we participate on the other. That links us in. That makes us guilty. It's through that second point that my proposal comes to bear on our issue for today. Okay, first element of the case. Two main points. First point, there are various obvious ways in which our practices and the acts of our representatives have overall very harmful consequences in the world. First of all, most of us, the well-off in the world, consume goods, including much food, that are produced by a massively complex economic and industrial worldwide system based largely on petroleum that is ravaging the earth. I'm going to give you a list here that comes from James Gustav Speth. Not a controversy. He's the dean of the Yale School of Forestry. He's a real, he was in Jimmy Carter's cabinet in some minor post. He's an insider. He's not a wild lefty. This is from Speth. There's consequent global warming, loss of forests, loss of land, loss of fresh water, loss of marine fisheries, toxic pollution, loss of biodiversity, over-fertilization with nitrogen, acid deposition, and ozone depletion. So there's Speth's list. This worldwide disaster is bad for all of us and our descendants. There's really no question about this. There's no serious question about this. It's also harmful for many animals, which I think is of some secondary importance. But the key point for us today is that it is extremely harmful to the very poor. They are often those least well-placed to deal with environmental disasters that face them. So if something happens in some poor part of the world due to this economic juggernaut, people don't have the resources to deal with it. In addition, much of the harm occasioned by our economic and industrial juggernaut is deflected onto those with least political power to resist it, especially the very poor in other countries. This also isn't really controversial. There's a book about this. There's Peter Dauvergne, Dauvergne, has a Canada research chair at British Columbia, and he's got a book about this called The Shadows of Consumption, which actually talks about a number of Canadian cases, which I don't know the details of. So that's part of my first case. The second point of the first element of my case will take a little longer to state, but not too much longer, I hope here. Extreme poverty is itself a great harm, rooted in our practices and the acts of our representatives. In 2009, over 1 billion people were undernourished every day. Billion people. And as I quote from no more left-wing publication than Scientific American, quote, "The main reason hunger and nutritional deficiencies persist is poverty. Many millions of households simply cannot afford to buy nutritious food or the farming supplies they need to grow enough of their own. The majority of the chronically malnourished live in rural areas in developing countries, but an overlapping billion of extremely impoverished people live in horrific urban slums, shanty towns, often in the southern hemisphere." If you want a hair-raising book about that, it's a little more lefty. Mike Davis, Planet of Slums, but it's been well received in standard publications. It's reliable. What you may reasonably ask, what does this have to do with us, with our practices or the acts of our representatives, which I promised you it had to do with? Many things. The poor of Europe once fled slums in the old world for a better life in the new, but the borders of many nations are now more or less closed. Governments of wealthy nations engage in strong armed bargaining when trade deals are made that are to the benefit of the citizens of that nation overall, or at least to the powerful agricultural interest in those nations, but to the cost of less powerful and wealthy nations and the poorest people in them. Poga has a lot of good material on that if you want to look it up. For instance, European and North American negotiators, trade negotiators, have a long-standing pattern of insisting on retaining agricultural subsidies for their own farmers, but also the elimination of agricultural subsidies and trade barriers in poor nations. What's more, our banks make loans to poor nations whose dictators slip the money into their own bank accounts abroad and leave the bill to their nation. Our industries grab the natural resources of poor nations at a good price, even if the dictators take the cash. You want hair-raising details on that. There's a book by Nicholas Shaxson called Poison Wells about oil in Nigeria. The IMF and the World Bank, often at the prodding of wealthy nations, have enforced what are called SAPs, structural adjustment programs, that have decimated agriculture in the third world and helped drive the poor into urban slums. Our nations, of course, my nation, of course, arms many dictators, and we are not shy about using our own military power to prop them up when it seems expedient. Still, you might say, so that's the first part of the course. We've got these practices, and it looks like they're very harmful to the very poor. we have representatives like our trade negotiators, and what they do seems to be very harmful to the very poor. But so far, we're not back quite to us. Can we make the next step back to us? Well, here goes. Still, you might say, what does this have to do with me? I don't negotiate trade pacts or police the borders or buy resources or loan money or run the IMF or the Pentagon. Even if I were a Nebraskan, like the speaker, I wouldn't negotiate trade pacts or police borders or buy resources, etc. And while I may buy an SUV to cruise to the store for some cigarettes, still that is not a consequentially significant harm. So here we come to the second part of my case. Now my job is to find some group acts in which you may participate that underlie some of the obvious, huge, horrendous effects of the world of the well-off, including our practices and the acts of our representatives, on the world of the extremely poor. Of course, I don't know you very well, so please forgive me if I slip into taking my colleagues and students in Nebraska as suitably representative. The first group act is a bad old friend. I like to call it artificial selfishness. Many moral philosophers and others, theologians, have been engaged for several millennia in a sort of risky gambit. Their idea has been that first we should convince people to be rational in some long-term and self-interested prudential sense, and then show them that long-term selfishness like that, in fact, surprise, surprise, requires morality. It's kind of a weird route. One way this has been worked out is by theologically minded philosophers, and I think, who have argued that long-term prudence, looking out for number one in the right, careful, selfish way, requires moral behavior. Why? On pain of hellfire. There are also secular versions of this. One of the most prominent Canadian philosophers is David Gautier, and a lot of his work has developed a secular analog of this view. I myself think that long-term maximization of individual self-interest isn't rational, no default rationality, and indeed it doesn't make any determinate sense. I think sometimes that it doesn't make sense to say some act meets that goal. I think it's an absurd fantasy of a goal rather than any genuine rational goal. But I'm not going to try to make that argument today. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to claim, at least, that involves a group act which is highly immoral. Here's how it goes. Someone who pursues the resolute maximization of long-term self-interest in any at all moralistic way, in any way supported by criticism that they would make, perhaps of themselves for a weak moment or of others, is part of a large group act, I think. Such people tend to criticize others and not just themselves for failures to abide by this rational ideal, though perhaps they occasionally suppress the external expression of that criticism when talking with those whom they hope to succor in a deal. They teach the ideal of long-term maximization of self-interest to their children and their students. They judge defectors to be irrationally imprudent, as failing to uphold the proper ideal of universal rationality. And all that criticism, I think, means that there's a group act there. Prudence of some minimal sort, self-regard of some minimal sort's one thing. I'm talking about ravenous and relentless long-term maximization of the satisfaction of every individual desire. Squeezing out over life every last dollar when we care about dollars, or every possible desire satisfaction. Now at this point you might be optimistic. Some people are. They say, oh, our desires are, kind of benevolent. So this isn't, if you squeeze out the satisfaction of every desire over life, you'll be a pretty good person. Maybe I'm cynical about that point, and maybe that point is where I'm wrong. But if, in fact, our desires, as I think, are mostly self-regarding, and when they involve our children, usually involve them in sort of selfish ways, we won't have that root out. But anyway, it's a striking fact that many ethicists today criticize those who are not so ravenously selfish as irrational. I think it's part of their gambit to get us back to morality. And if indeed this is a very harmful group act, which I think is, which I'll try not to argue, maybe this is immoral. In fact, maybe our participation in this group act of talking ourselves and our children into squeezing out every satisfaction over life that they can get is in fact a cause of great harm in the world. No doubt humans have a certain selfishness and instinctive prudence more or less by nature, relevant to the baseline of assessment for this kind of moral practice. But if the additional harmful consequences of this artificial selfishness is our own responsibility, we've got a problem. Let's see, let me keep skipping. It's not an accident that people are reluctant to give to charity or restrain even obscene and unimportant consumption. It's not an accident that our politicians know that they will prosper if they make sure our trivial interests are served by trade policies, even at severe cost to the world's most vulnerable. It's not an accident that our banks and industries close their eyes to corruption in third world markets, since they face their stockholders. It's not an accident that our economic and industrial system inflicts enormous harm for trivial reasons, that terrible worldwide damage is done in pursuit of something no more worthwhile than cheap hamburger for we the healthy and wealthy. But it isn't inevitable or natural in some deep way. There is no need for us to be so grasping. People in the past were sometimes in traditional societies less grasping. Perhaps we are somewhat grasping by nature, but we've been trained into the final refinements of this artificial selfishness. In fact, there's even considerable empirical evidence that it doesn't make us as individuals any appreciably happier. Two well-received psychologists, Ed Diener and Martin Seligman's review of the empirical work on self-reports of happiness conclude that a good formula for happiness in your own eyes is to live in a democratic and stable society that provides adequate material resources to meet needs, to have supportive friends and family, to have rewarding and engaging work and an adequate income, to be reasonably healthy and have treatment available in case of mental problems, and to have important goals related to one's values. More money for more luxuries makes almost no difference. It has almost no correlation with greater happiness. In other words, our coruscating, maximizing artificial selfishness, if I'm right, there is such a thing, does each of us little good. But there's no question that our pursuit of trivial features of self-interest and luxury is now making the poorly off even worse off. I think Pogue is right. And this is the group act that principally shows that he is. I'm now going to skip over, well, I'll read a couple more of them. There's other ways group acts are involved. I think that's our principal sinful group act, but there are also others. I bet you would have, like me, some tendency to criticize someone on grounds of their failure for proper respect and reciprocity, which is supposed to indicate a group act is there, who stole your chrome hubcaps, even before you stop to ask how poor they were and whether they needed the money. This suggests that you and I bear responsibility for a vast group act of respect for property that includes the bank account of the deposed dictator living down the road who bled his nation dry. Or consider our responsibility for the actions of the corporations whose stock we buy on grounds that require that they maximize profits and such that we would criticize if they went resolutely green and didn't maximize profits. How about nations in which we participate? It could easily be that just participation in a nation state involves cooperation in a group act. And if, like mine, the consequences of that nation state on the world are obviously highly negative, it's possible that that's in itself an immoral group act in which we participate. But there are a lot of different cases. Certainly, there's reason to think Americans, I believe Canadians, bear heavy responsibility for U.S. and Canadian trade policy and for the actions of our trade negotiators when they act in interest that we insist be served. So let me skip some more. There's good news, though. There's people on the other side engaged in a group act. You know what they do. They resolutely avoid, unlike me, harmful and wasteful consumption. For instance, they avoid eating meat when things that grow efficiently in the local ground will do. They do not rapaciously pursue every dollar possible desired satisfaction. They strive to save the environment. They serve the poor. They work against social forms that are harmful and strive to create forms that are helpful. They have a virtue that I'm tempted to call, with very little irony, political correctness. I think this, too, is a group act. I think over time, over history, it's a pretty big group act. I think there's, in particular, a very large group act involving many observant members of traditional religious groups, and also atheists, spread over millennia, that requires the contribution of at least 2.5% of annual income to support the starving and malnourished. How do they come up with this? Well, I was trying to look for a consensus. You have traditional tithing, Judeo-Christian tithing, you have Muslim zakat practice, there are various practices. You can sort of find a very large practice that includes people that think we have a moral obligation to contribute 2.5%. And it seems that it's had quite an effect over history. It's a big group act. Let's see. I think if you're inside that act to a little degree, and I think you are to the degree you feel the sting of not contributing in that traditional way to poverty, we're probably, according to my theory, required to fulfill our role in that group act. And if we fail to do so, it would be highly immoral. If we're not inside that group act, if I'm so rapaciously selfish and corrupted by greed that I don't even feel the sting, if I'm not even inside the act to a degree, probably I'm required to join it, and then I'm going to be bound inside. I've been making a lot of suggestions the last part of the talk that almost all philosophical ethicists won't agree with. All this stuff about group acts. But the point of it really is to get you to think about what you think individual moral obligations on the part of what individual moral obligations follow on the part of all of us from the fact, which seems very clearly to be a fact, that our social arrangements and our representatives do things that are very harmful to the very poor. Maybe my story about what our obligations in that context are is wrong. What's your theory? What's your view about what our obligations are in that circumstance? And I'll say a little more and then I'll stop. There's some philosophers today who like to say that we know that morality cannot be as morally demanding as I am saying it is today. It's not too demanding, 2.5%. But it seems to me that a contribution of 2.5% of annual income cannot plausibly be said to be too demanding, at least on the basis of any widespread common sense moral consensus. Why is this? Because very many in many ancient religious traditions have given at least this much, and they were generally poorer than we are. Nor is it a trivial drop in the bucket. Remember what I said at the beginning. It's twice what is necessary. As I said, one reasonable recent estimate suggests that shifting 1.25% of the aggregate income enjoyed by the billion people who live in high-income economies would plausibly eradicate serious poverty worldwide. If we, the well-off, did our moral duty, to put it straight, if we weren't immoral, there would be little serious chronic poverty in the world, probably. But there's no denying that 2.5% is a little demanding. Maybe we think Liam Murphy, who's another philosopher, is right when he says we only need to give 1.25%. Why? It's less than our ancestors gave, traditionally, and we're a lot richer than they are. But after all, it's all that would really be required if everybody did their part to solve the problem. That's a possible view as well. But I think, though there are lots of possible views here, I would submit to you for your consideration that it's clear that we must change our lives, if only a little bit. Thanks. Thank you very much.
suppose I'm going to be the first one.
Okay, thank you.
You mentioned Peter Singer in your talk, who I think is probably one of the most important moral philosophers alive today. And his work on this question is probably the most well-known. I actually had the privilege of seeing him speak at the University of Melbourne a few months ago. But one of the important points that he made, and I read sort of an abridged version of the article that you mentioned, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And one of the important points that he made was, it seemed to me at least, was that even if we're doing what we think would be our fair share, if everyone was doing their fair share, that 2.5% of our income, as you put it, it's not enough that I just do my fair share. What he says is that we have to give to, in this case, the point of marginal utility, which is, that's what he calls it, and essentially means we give to the point at which we're not sacrificing anything on our part of comparable moral worth to someone's life. So if you can give $200 to save the life of a child, then if every one child's life is worth $200 and you have $800 to give, you should be giving all of that $800. So I guess my question is, it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem, because if not everyone is doing their fair share, and the people who realize, or I guess if they accept the conclusions of someone like Peter Singer, that they have to do something, then they end up giving to the point of marginal utility. How do we, it's such a daunting problem.
Right.
If everyone was doing their fair share, it wouldn't be a problem. But
yeah, no, that's it's a very good question. It's the central. I mean, it's the question to ask. The question to ask is, or one of the questions to ask, look, not everybody gives the 2.5. Not everybody gives the 1.25. And what if only a few people are going to give the 1.25? Singer says, he's suggested, there's more obligation on you now to give more. And how boundless will this be? You can foresee that just about every dollar that you might spend on yourself, even for relatively serious matters, not silly things like vacations and expensive meals like I've been suggesting, but housing that's more than minimum and clothing that's more than minimum. Maybe that's immoral, because that money surely could be better spent saving a life or saving many lives abroad. And if we looked at it in that way, then it looks like in the real world in which we live, the moral demands on us are overwhelming. Now, I think his suggestion was maybe that's just a fact and we have to live with it. Some people look at that and they say, oh, anything that leads to that is completely unacceptable and we know there's something wrong. I'm kind of in the middle, wishy-washy. He may be right. Singer may be right. My thought is that with this group act mechanism, I can find you some group acts to hide behind, to be perfectly frank. That there's some other group acts that you engage in that you'd be wrong to defect from, and that they shield you from certain kinds of demands. I don't know if that works, but that's one idea. Another idea is some people think there's a difference between what you're morally required to do and what would be morally supererogatory, as philosophers say, sort of like morally a good thing. And you can make a story about why it might be seriously immoral or more seriously immoral not to give the 2.5 and only less than optimally moral not to give more. But it's a serious issue, and there's a lot of... I didn't tell you about that because because I'm hoping if demand is less, right, that people might seriously consider doing something about it. Whereas if I say to you, the demand is something you can't bring yourself to meet, you'll shrug it off. But he's right, there's a serious issue. You're absolutely right about that. And I'm trying to, weasel my way into something that people could actually live by. Maybe I'll fail to do that. Other questions? Sure.
Hi, my question is, it's less about the problem of poverty and more a question about what ethicists do, so it may also be maybe less interesting, but or harder to articulate. I don't know. But the question that you're trying to answer is, I think, trying to locate the moral obligation to act. And it seems like you are, and a lot of the authors that you're telling us about are putting a lot of effort into trying to locate that moral obligation. And I wonder whether that's a useful project, like whether describing it in terms of moral obligation is really how we should be spending our time. Is it enough just to, which is something that I think Peter Singer does fairly well, to illustrate the nature of the problem to us and to describe acts to us as either morally praiseworthy or blameworthy or somewhere in between. And that seems to be what it takes to incent some people to act. Right. So I just wonder if it feels a little bit like we tie ourselves up in knots trying to pinpoint and use this philosophical language of obligation. I wonder if that's useful.
Right. I mean, many people think you should, I mean, some people think they should, I mean, there are many proposals, but some people think you should just go scalar and say some acts are better than others, and that's how we should just rank them and not worry at all about questions of obligation. And some people also think that to focus, some of us are trying to find something here in the middle or maybe even at the low end to get people, and they think it's a mistake even to give people that sort of out. There's actually literature now suggesting that any attempt to fall short of the full Singerian demand is morally problematic. I think those are things to explore. I think that my hope is that if we think about the things in a cold way, and explore various options. And then we think about options that include relatively undemanding alternatives that we know that people in the world have adopted and followed, that even if we come to see that the language of obligation is somehow inappropriate, it can still reveal to people that if they think about their own lives in sort of a cold way, they might feel motivated to change up to a moderate level. So I don't really disagree with you. I think that we have to look at a range of options, and I don't know what really we're going to end up deciding is correct. Probably we won't agree. I mean, you favor the more, is a scalar thing the thing you're thinking about, or something more?
I don't know if I know the answer to the question.
Yeah. I mean, the point of this is to think about these things. And, you know, not all the options are well explored. I went to the wrong place, sorry. Not all the options are well explored. There are lots and lots of issues. There's lots and lots of controversies amongst philosophers. And there's lots of non-controversies about philosophers because there aren't enough philosophers to go around to have controversies about them. So there's a lot of issues here that need to be thought about. And I think if we think together about them, we'll have a better chance of figuring out how this works. So thank you. Other questions?
First of all, thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
I'm one of the philosophers who is sympathetic to there being a need for talking about group acts, group responsibility, motivation, and getting motivation. When it comes to large-scale harms that are committed by groups. The question I have for you, I think this is one of the sections where you started, then you skipped over a little bit, so I want to hear a little bit more about what separates a group act from an accumulated act of a bevy of individuals, and how do you get the sense of motivation and responsibility? Because with the example of the buzzer and the associate dean, I can still make the case that my not buzzing isn't going to result in the associate dean, escaping unscathed or with their life. So that sort of worry.
Yeah, about the particular case, I mean, my view is even if your choice is to participate or not to participate. Now, the act will go on whether you participate or not, and the dean's going to be, fairly severely tortured even if you don't do anything. To a certain kind of consequentialist, I think, maybe you, it will plausibly seem, well, not participating, that's not enough. Right? I mean, it doesn't save the dean anything that you don't, or what saves the dean is some triviality. But I'm focusing on the issue of the individual responsibility. I'm saying you won't be responsible for the consequent if you defect. Maybe we think I mean, there are things in the world that you can't change. Maybe we think in this case somehow if you could somehow prevent the others from acting, then you probably have responsibility for that. But I was assuming you didn't have that as your option.
Mm-hmm. Just a final.
But the other, sorry.
No, I do think there's an interesting tie, though, if you take on a mentality where you've got individuals thinking that in unison, then you do have a significant consequence for the group act. But anywho.
Sure. And the other thing is, I mean, the other part of the question is about the conditions on group action and when they generate, at least I'm taking it to be, there's lots of alternative views about group acts, some richer than mine, some weaker, and they have different implications here, and I wouldn't presume to try to convince you that mine is the right one. So, I mean, we have to, there's many different accounts of group acts, how rich the conditions have to be before you have a group act. And notice how that plays into the issue here. If I can claim that there are group acts that give us responsibilities, that depends on the conditions for the group acts being relatively weak. Maybe if the conditions for having group action are fancier and stronger, require more, our group acts aren't responsible for poverty. But I think, you know, I have my view, but there are alternative views, and the thing that you suggested is a plausible alternative. Are there other? Yeah.
We're lining up.
Okay, good.
If I understand you right, you think that an awful lot of rich people are, as it were, complicit in torturing the dean. So we're all somehow engaged in a group act that's screwing over poor people. And it takes very little, on your view, for us to be engaged in this group act. It seems like all we have to do is think that it's not irrational to try to pursue what you desire. And that means we're endorsing a culture where people take means to their ends.
Yep.
And therefore, that makes us responsible for any bad consequences that happen, and I suppose that puts us under an obligation to engage in a group act to ameliorate those consequences.
Almost to the last, yeah, let's say yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have a number of concerns
I was
about
going
this.
to jump. Okay.
I mean, first, something has vastly increased the average standard of living over the last 300 years, and I take it it's something more or less like people taking means to their ends. And so all of these group acts that you see as having negative consequences for poor people also have vastly many extremely positive consequences. So surely that has to be taken into account. The second thing is this: the same activities have probably not only impoverished some people or made the conditions of some impoverished people worse, but have also led to increases in cancer, heart disease, insanity, depression. So list all the ills there are in the world. All of them are probably in some way or other traceable back to people pursuing means to their ends. Each of them is probably such that it would take between 1% and 2% of the GDP to solve those things. So now all of a sudden I own not just 1% of the impoverished people of Africa, but I don't know, 98% of my income to take care of cancer. And the third thing is, it strikes me as profoundly implausible to say that all it takes to make me complicit in a group act to screw over poor people is that I say to my kids, you should pursue your goals, take means to your ends, be instrumentally rational.
Yeah, well, instrumental rationality itself doesn't require maximization of self-interest. But you mean the full-blooded. You mean full-blooded maximization of desire satisfaction over the really hard. Yeah. Well, in a way, you kind of agree with me up to a point, which I guess I'm happy for, which is that this practice does have effects on the world. That the optional, are we agreeing on this? The sort of optional conception of self-interest as maximization has, in fact, in the past led to positive, you're suggesting to positive economic development or something like that. Is that right?
Well, I would want to say that taking the means to one's ends is what it is to voluntarily have an effect on the world. I mean, that's what an action is. So unless somebody's doing that, then they're not acting. And if they're not acting, then they're certainly not responsible for what's happened.
I don't think that it's a necessary requirement of action to be committed to the maximization of the satisfaction of your own desires. I think that weaker conditions that are other parts of the thing that you mean can get us to things like instrumental rationality that are, and I'm not really speaking about why those parts are bad. I don't have any particular argument that those parts are bad. But in addition, I mean, I think you might be right, even if I'm right about the nature of the group act. He says, look, it's had some good consequences. We'd all be, and maybe it has. Maybe I'm wrong about the consequences of the group act, in which case, well, what I say here isn't relevant. Depends on what the consequences of the group act are. Second point, it's possible that the group act has had good consequences, and then as times change, right, it needs to be somewhat modified because of changing conditions. And it's possible, that we're sort of both right, that this mentality is a group act, that it's had very good consequences, and now somehow, because of changed conditions in the world, it's leading us astray. Maybe we can tweak it a little bit, so it still has the good consequences that he wants, but not quite the harmful effects that I want, or the harmful effects I don't want. So I think, there's a range of possible alternatives here to consider. But I don't really think, I think we do have some alternatives. It doesn't seem to me that somebody gives 2.5% of their income to, the poor. It's hard to see what argument there could be that would show such a person wasn't acting fully or wasn't fully rational. I don't think that argument's there. Maybe you don't agree. I mean, maybe you agree with me about that. Sure.
All right, I'd like to step away from groupthink and group acts
sure.
for a moment. My question in the end will end up being sort of two-part. You mentioned that at a certain point, increase in wealth no longer equals to increase in happiness. I have seen a number of lectures on this point, and I do wholeheartedly concur, so that provides no reason why I couldn't contribute my excess wealth to someone else. But for example, I don't live in the greatest neighborhood. The bushes beside my house are known to house bums. And when I walk by, I don't give them my change. And this is maybe immoral of me, but I don't give them my change because I don't know whether they're going to feed themselves a meal, which I would support, or if they're going to go buy themselves a Colt 45 and get drunk, which compounds the problem. So my question ends up being whether, by focusing internationally and just throwing money at the problem, are we potentially compounding it? And second, is it more immoral to focus internationally rather than domestic?
Right, many questions, and all relevant questions. One thing, my guess is you have less disposable income than some of the older people in the room. And I think that's relevant. I think that is relevant. The second point is, I was talking about the international case. There are people who think the national boundaries are significant in some way. They say that some of the differences in the cases that I started out with, the envelope and the pond, are due to national boundaries. It's actually very complicated if you start pushing at your intuitions about the case, and that's one thing Cam is really good at. It turns out we have intuitions you wouldn't even guess we had. Like, I certainly never guessed we had about if you have a rocket here that's about to go off and you know it's going to land in Japan, I bet it doesn't undercut your sense of responsibility that what will happen that it's going to land in Japan, because the thing is going to initiate here, right? So probably there's more complexities. It isn't that we don't feel we have obligations beyond national boundaries. It's sort of more like where the source of the harmful activity is. So I don't want to claim that I've exhausted that topic. It's an interesting topic, and there's lots to be done on it. The thing about the spending it on the Colt 45, I mean, that's an analogy for what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is not people spending money on Colt 45s. We're talking about people starving and don't have the opportunity to buy Colt 45s. But I think there's a kind of there might be an implication there that there are other factors that we need to think about. And maybe one of the general factors we have to think about that's relevant to the poverty case, when poverty is abroad, is some people have argued historically that if we do something now, it's only going to get worse, right? Or perhaps it'll create a culture of dependency abroad or something that will have bad effects. So your actual act of attempted charity will in fact cause a greater harm. There is work on that as well. And one thing I didn't mention, it generally seems to be the case. It seems to be generally accepted that if wealth increases, population rate goes down. Population growth goes down. Maybe because there's also other factors involved, but like, for instance, educating women has a high effect on, and unoppressing women has a high effect on lowering the birth rate. But so too does increased wealth. And some people, Marcia Sen is one person who does it ably, and something that you can access, actually, if I can find my pages here. There's a New York Review article he has in 1994 in the New York Review where he talks about that issue and tries to reveal factors that are relevant to think about. And so though there are possible factors like that, my belief is empirically that in this particular case that I'm talking about, we don't have to worry about them. I could be wrong about that, and there are various experts about that, and you can consult them. There are also controversies about the way aid is directed. I'm sure you've heard about all, if the government is unstable or corrupt in various ways, it's difficult to direct aid, that it's an effective way. And there's a lot of controversies about how to best target agricultural aid, what form it should have. It's a very complicated question. Probably you could do it in a bad way. But there also seem to be ways empirically that are seem to be empirically supported as good ways to do it. And there's a literature on that as well. So they're all important factors that just make this issue more complicated. But we don't have any strong reason, I believe, to think that a significant effort at poverty relief directed internationally would really have bad effects. It just has to be carefully and cleverly and sophisticatedly done. Usually the organizations that are successful try to work on developing local agriculture. That's one route that seems to work. And Oxfam is one organization that does that. There are others as well. Sure, sorry.
I was drawn up to the mic by something, not that you said, but someone said in asking a question. They were basically saying that we're wealthier today than we were in the 30s because of collective acts of selfishness, of maximizing our own activities. And I'm going to argue otherwise, that in fact we would be much poorer today, that if in the mid-40s some people hadn't undertaken acts of altruism, including their own lives, that while some people give 1.25%, some people give all, as you know that song, that's probably a bit more standard in the U.S. than here. But my point is that we don't necessarily have to look around and make sure that all of us are giving 1.25%. Some of us just have to do our best and inspire others. And I don't know whether philosophy is capturing those kind of charismatic acts that lead other people to do it. I mean, you know what happens. The guys are going forward, machine guns start, they all go to the ground. One guy, for whatever reason, gets up and starts making a wild chase, and they all follow, and they overtake the place. But he dies. We don't know why, but it may only take a relatively few numbers of altruistic acts to end poverty. It may not take a cold, rational looking around, making sure that everyone else is behind it.
Right.
Sometimes you just have to charge ahead.
So moral exemplars would have an effect on people's behavior.
Hi, thank you. I very much enjoyed your talk. I think I learned stuff. I've enjoyed it. My question speaks to the image of the pond. In the scenario you gave, you had the guy walking around the pond spotting a boy, and it was at some personal cost to himself that he would save the child. My first point is, or the first thing I want to talk about is the possibility of walking by, seeing the drowning child, and losing nothing except your clothes, becoming wet. You're still going to save the child. Yes, that makes sense.
I just didn't hear. I think I didn't hear the end of you. Sorry, I got up to the. Yeah.
If you're walking around the pond and the child is in the water and you aren't going to lose anything at all.
I see.
There still seems to be an imperative to
jump in,
rescue the child.
I think so. And you're suggesting that might be a difference between the two cases?
No, you seem to have put a lot of emphasis on the 2.5%. Your response to a grave ethical problem seems to be send cash now, right? This is it in a blatant form. I just want to suggest that ethical problems call for ethical responses, not necessarily monetary responses.
Okay.
I would suggest to you, rather than emphasis on the group, emphasis on individual needs, and individuals who are not responding to hunger are in a sense walking by the drowning boy in the pond. So you have to sensitize them to the situation the drowning child is in. And rather than cash, perhaps fasting once a week for a 24-hour period so that they bodily experience hunger
And
as a first and an essential step, rather than just send cash, right? That just
right. Do you think that would then sensitize people so they would send cash, or are you thinking it would sensitize people so they would act in other ways that would be helpful to the...
I think what might come out of it is an awareness of what hunger is, and I think that's not readily apparent in our society.
Right, okay. And maybe, and it's possible to think, I mean, it's possible to think that the immorality is the unawareness, right? Maybe people differ about topics like this, but maybe the immorality, the principal immorality in the situation is that we've avoided thinking about something. I mean, as I said, I'm a consequentialist, so I'm going to say, well, even if you thought about it and are aware of it, and if you're not doing anything about it, it's not enough. And you weren't.
Yeah,
you're
I
not
certainly agree with that.
Yeah.
I certainly
So
believe we have to do something about it.
As a first step to sensitize us. Sure. Yeah.
This is, excuse me, this is somewhat connected. You've
Okay.
done a real lumping of participating in a group act and perpetuating a group act.
True.
We have myself wanting to make my life a little bit happier, buying myself the SUV, and then there's the case of telling my children that ravenous self-interest is good. I think this becomes more controversial with the do-gooder group act, because most people do think you're a moral great person if you eat your vegan lattes fair trade. But when you start to perpetuate that by casting that obligation onto others, they tend not to like you. There's no one wants to be the
Somehow I get the
pushy
sense
jerk.
you're not endorsing that reaction that they're having. Or are you endorsing it, or are you
Well, I'm
just
wondering if
observing
that reaction unfounded? Is it a greater? Do I have a moral responsibility just to be good, or also to try to encourage others to be good?
If I roll my view up, it says, what does the view say here? What it would say is, if there aren't any group acts involved, then you've got your consequential responsibilities to do the thing that has the best consequences. And if you could get people to join and do good, then you ought to do it. But I mean, the other issue you raise is a complex feature of the account, and that is whether the group acts, the participation in the group acts involves itself just doing things or refraining from doing things or actually trying to propagate the group act. And I think that will depend on the details of the group acts. And I was assuming in the case that I talked about, the self-interest, the maximizing self-interest conception, that it had both elements. I could easily be wrong about that. I wasn't assuming that was true of some of the other group acts I talked about, like the Lying Act. Maybe I'd be wrong about that too.
And is it true of the do-gooder act?
I don't have a view about that. I guess I hadn't thought about that. So I guess it could be that there's two group acts, one that has more commitments than the other, and that some people will participate in one. And there's what I call a concentric group act that includes the same individuals, some of the same individuals in the larger act, but which have further commitments. That's what I say off the top of my head. But it isn't something I thought about before. Okay. Thanks. Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
Housekeeping matters. First of all, I want to thank Chris Stover again very much for all her. It's not even help. All her organizing for this evening, and CCEPA. And I'd like to remind you of the evaluation forms that Chris drew your attention to before. Fill them out if you're able and inclined. I wanted to thank everybody for showing up. It was a good crowd with some very good questions. I've been asked to draw to your attention a table outside in the lobby, which has been set up by Oxfam. They're taking donations for the East African food crisis. And if you'll excuse the incongruity, there's also a reception for us out in the lobby, including a cash bar. Finally, I wanted to present on behalf of the president of St. Mary's a gift to Dr. Mendola in gratitude for his coming all the way from Nebraska and for the talk he's delivered tonight. I can tell you what it is. It's a lovely hardcover book with pictures of Nova Scotia, of Halifax, the sea, the harbor, ships, all that sort of thing. They have a modest stock of these in the president's office, but you have to make a case to them. So I simply told the secretary, look, the poor guy's from Nebraska. He's landlocked in Lincoln, and he needs his seascapes. So they went for that. So Joe, thanks very much.